Hello, everyone. This is Stephen, and this is the second part of my conversation with Dr. Robert Albro. In our previous conversation, we talked about his work in Bolivia, and today we're going to be talking about security. He's done a lot of work in the US military and how people in the military think about culture and the cultures of the places that they have active military campaigns in. So, for example, in the war in Iraq, how they think about or Afghanistan, how they think about Afghani culture, so to speak. We're also going to connect it to data science and how anthropologists should maybe connect or work with data scientists and the new fields in AI. So I hope you enjoy. And in case you're still wondering, I'm still in the rainforest in Malaysia on the Borneo side. I did want to ask you about a little bit about what you talked about at the wee beginning, that studying a lot of the national security in the ways that they talked about
Sure.
things. I wanted to ask you some about that too. So, like, what did you discover in your research there at a high level?
Yeah. Right. Thanks. So I got kind of dragooned into this, and I say that to some extent, not pejoratively, just simply, when the American Anthropological Association decided it needed to act to address this emerging kind of debate about the extent to which anthropology as a profession should be utilized for the purposes of national security. Since I was the Committee for Human Rights chair at that time, they're like, "You're on this group. You're going to be part of this group." And I was like, "Okay." And so at the time, I wasn't necessarily pursuing any of those concerns in a research way or ethnographic way or anything. But one of the things that became particularly interesting to me, and which I was most observant about, was how U.S. military personnel, and we're primarily talking here about the Marine Corps and the Army, understood anthropological knowledge in its capacity as something that could be appropriated and utilized on the battlefield. And this was at a moment in both Afghanistan and Iraq where the terms of our conflicts there shifted as we embraced new strategies and tactics in those places, focusing on so-called counterinsurgency. And so counterinsurgency is this warfighting doctrine. So there was a doctrinal shift at a certain point that emphasizes urban warfare, urban warfighting, and the importance of civilian populations as possible assets in kind of winning the so-called hearts and minds of a population in the midst of which there is this ongoing conflict, right? So that's what the U.S. Military and intelligence communities were engaged in trying to undertake. How do we build a effective counterinsurgency operation in these places? And our understanding of how we do that involves, among other things, understanding the cultural context within which these civilian populations are living and working, and how they are sort of understanding the world so that we can meet them where they're at. The way that military commanders tended to think about this was, we need to know what makes them tick, right? So I would describe it as a very kind of reductively behavioral model of how kind of culture works in society, where everyone has, like a model in their head, and they all think the same thing, and that model is shared across some social group or community, and that's what quote unquote culture is. And so as long as we can just kind of decode the model, we can anticipate and predict how these people are going to behave, and that's useful for us as we engage in our counterinsurgency work and our winning of hearts and minds, right? So that very loosely, very simplistically is kind of the idea. And it was really kind of what interested me in this from a purely research point of view, setting aside the ethical questions around the use of social science knowledge for the purposes of warfare, which are, I think, acute, was this emphasis on sort of the use of predictive social science in that sense. So social science in its application here in the military and security environment is only valuable if it provides us with this ability to anticipate, to know what others are going to think before we engage with them, and to confer an advantage in our engagement with them as a result of our understanding of their kind of cultural way of being, but which is understood as a very behavioral notion of what they do in response to what they think, right? A sort of cause and effect. They think this, so they do that. And so we should be able to anticipate that as long as we understand how they think. And so that fascinated me, the hubris of that, that we could essentially read minds and, on the basis of that, form an effective and accurate model that we could then mobilize to, good effect on the battlefield in conflict zones, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So for me, that was an opportunity to understand, kind of the national security landscape as a certain kind of expert community that processes information in particular ways. A great example of this is cultural mapping. So Marine Corps in particular was very interested in that there could be tools, cultural smart cards, and other things that would just simply lay out, kind of the critical connections and the shape of a given culture, because what they wanted was a map. Because for the Marine Corps, one of the most important things is, the terrain. We need to be able to navigate the terrain. And so human terrain, in this sense, is included as kind of part of the terrain that we now need to navigate. And to navigate it effectively, we need a freaking map. So could you give us a map, please? And so suddenly, you have anthropological knowledge put to the task of generating something like a map, which could be, portable and put in your pocket, like a smart card, a cultural smart card, that you could quickly, reference, in the midst of some kind of conflict. And then that would then be a useful tool, right? So anyway, that all the debate around human terrain and related issues kind of brought me into, let's call it the burgeoning field of the anthropology of security. And, I've looked at that in different ways periodically over the years, human, sociocultural, behavioral modeling. What are the assumptions built into that? It's one thing to model the weather system. It's another thing to model human behaviors in the aggregate, big data as it relates to, cultural questions and the emphasis on predictability. So a lot of there's something called a field that hasn't really taken off, but it's kind of a variation of the digital humanities called culturomics. So it's modeled on, genomics. And the idea is, we can create a kind of predictive model of, aggregate cultural behavior to do things like predict, the Arab Spring or something like that before it happens. So these kinds of fields, the application of like social and cultural knowledge for the purpose of, meeting security goals, is sort of how I've gone about that work over time, beyond just the specific responding to, the association's call to address this human terrain debate or conflict or argument or disagreement in the context of, U.S. counterinsurgency campaigns in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So that's a quick capsule summary.
This is very interesting. So I guess a question I have is, and this is, well, here's a broad question, so also feel free to kind of narrow to a specific example, but how does this play out? So this is me kind of just thinking through this out loud, but it seems like, you have people that kind of have a single like this, the culture is a monolith. Like this is how they respond over there, whether that's Iraq, Afghanistan, like whatever, wherever that is. And but like that's not, like you already hinted at, that's not how people work on a pretty fundamental level. So there's seems to be a bit of a disconnect there, but like that, so I could see that creating a type of tension, but maybe power can kind of insulate, power in multiple senses of the word, like can lead to, can maintain ignorance, can sometimes people will conform to people's image when they're in power for specific strategic reasons. Um and um but also, like I could see communities, if you're trying to predict, and that just, if it if it's not successful, that's a point of tension with the goals of that research. And it seems like when it, like humans have been trying to predict human behavior. I mean, there's philosophers in the 1800s that I think tried to make similar types of forecasts, and it didn't work then. It's probably not going to work now. But like the it, I don't know. Like maybe the like knowledge economy, they just kind of say what the leaders in the military want to hear, and then kind of maintain a bubble. Or yeah, how does all this play out?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's a big question, and there's several strands to it. So I'll just tug on a few of these. So one of the issues is with the, I'll call it the fungibility of the culture concept. So as you know, the culture concept, there was a sort of reaction within the discipline of anthropology circa late 80s into the 1990s. That was essentially a rejection of a kind of holistic approach to culture, that complex whole E.B. Tyler approach where we could describe in the terms of the unitary terms, different cultures of different societies, as if, kind of filling out like a noodle map of the world or something. What happened, though, was that was an inconclusive debate, I would say. And so we sort of went through it. We sort of complicated the stories we wanted to tell about the question of culture in ways emphasizing its historical specificity, its partiality, its the role of power, all kinds of ways in which cultural narratives are more complicated than we would have talked about in Ruth Benedict's era or something like that. But then we just kind of moved on. And so people went back to talking about cultural this and cultural that, kind of not having really addressed this issue comprehensively, I would say. But one of the reasons for why that was the case, I would argue, is because there have always been, within anthropology and more broadly, multiple accounts of the efficacy of the culture concept. One is broadly behavioral in orientation, like what I was describing earlier for, the Marine Corps. Another is expressive. Another is a symbols and meaning approach, Gertz and company. None of these are necessarily kind of mutually comprehensible or compatible, but they kind of coexist, right? In many ways, this stems from the fundamental kind of tension between culture as a total way of life concept that anthropology enshrined as its kind of master disciplinary term of reference, at least within North American anthropology, and culture in the sense of high culture and the arts and so on. So that's an originary tension in the term, and I think that tension gets played out in ways where it becomes easy for expert communities who are outside of the discipline of anthropology to pick and choose from among the various options out there in ways that fit best for the goals and aims that they already have. And so I think that's the important story to tell about why U.S. military and security officials find kind of the very behavioral, cultural modeling, thinking, doing, predictive version of culture to be maximally attractive, because it gives them the instrument or the tool that then allows them to do what they want to do, which is essentially plan out, in the case of counterinsurgency, a doctrinal way of approaching, of solving a problem. In this case, the recalcitrance of, say, the Afghani people to the presence of U.S. military personnel in their country. Things of that nature. So that, I think, is one of the big issues. I also think that, anthropology has not done a good job at building, over time, building kind of comprehensive relationships with, sort of policy decision-making bodies. And that we, as a discipline, have sort of fashioned ourselves as the kind of knowledgeable outsider discipline, very interested in, coming to the discussion saying, yes, but, among the so-and-so, it doesn't work that way, right? The famous negative instance approach to winning an argument. But haven't really spent a lot of time, saying we should be engaged in regular dialogue with and participating actively in, the relevant policy spaces. And so part of the story of the human terrain issue is that what we have is a discipline that largely ignored the implications of, kind of U.S. security postures in the world and, the security policy making universe, which is vast, but critiqued it to some extent from without really talking among ourselves about this. And then became alarmed when they drew their own conclusions about it and started doing things that anthropologists viewed as deeply problematic, and I think justifiably. So, had there been better lines of communication there, I think maybe there would have been an earlier understanding of some of the complexities involved in this and the maybe unrealistic nature of some of the assumptions that decision makers in these spaces were making at the time. Instead, they listened to a few people who were very enthusiastic about pushing this idea, who could speak coherently about it, and it sounded good, right? Rather than having a broader conversation with a wider subset of people within a discipline who might have different views on this and complicate the story going forward. Maybe, right, adding a touch of humility to, what eventually might happen. So these are some of the things.
Yeah, I mean, this makes total sense. So I'm both an anthropologist and a data scientist. In some of the tech spaces I've worked, I have seen some parallels to these threads, maybe in the less high-profile situations of it, but kind of similar. Like sometimes it's not a coherent response about how one should be approaching it. Will kind of fall among almost like populist social scientists, people who will come in and much more charismatically articulate a vision. Yeah, what were you going to say?
Yeah. Well, so data science is really a great space for how some of these things play out, and I would say is a great opportunity for productive research and practice sort of engagement, right? So, here with the notion of modeling, people get the idea that, if you critique modeling as a process, agent-based modeling or whatever, systems modeling, you're somehow anti. That's not really it. But if you look at how models are built, right, particularly in the space where we're interested in the sort of the predictive modeling for human social cultural behavior, what you see is a fascinating social dynamic, and it works like this. And you're probably familiar with this. Data fluent scientists and computer programming expert types and tech folk are approached by someone with an idea. They say, oh, sure, give us the data, we can do that. So then that person goes, okay. And so they start constructing the model. And then at a certain late phase in this conversation, maybe a social scientist or two are brought in for like verifiability purposes. But that's kind of it. And they're not really having like a balanced, in the sense of power balance, a productive conversation with the engineers or the modelers or the people building the model. And so the people building the model have, of course, said, look, we understand, Boolean, this, that, the other. We know how models work. And so as long as we can have the data, we can give you, we can build that thing. Now then, the social science, the ethnographer comes in and says, whoa, 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 no, this data is Facebook posts or something, or you're just mining, big data mining, X, and that's not useful because this, that, and the other, or whatever. You need to do this and so on. The people go, well, that's not useful because what we need is structured data that we can use in the model. And they go, oh, okay, well, okay. So there's not really this like interdisciplinary conversation that ever happens that could build, a complexly nuanced, set of modeling tools that might in some way reflect complex cultural questions on the ground, let's say. And so for models to work, you have to have a sort of certain systems holistic version of culture, and without that it's a non-starter, right? So sort of like what culture is in many ways very much built into the necessary conditions of the task as it's been set, mostly by people who are non-experts in questions of culture, right? And that's a very common thing. So I'm like charitably optimistic about the usefulness of modeling as a tool, but I'm also skeptically pessimistic about the extent to which that will ever seriously grapple with kind of social cultural complexity in a way that we might describe as realistic, if that makes sense. But that's like a typical policy into practice universe, right? Like frontier that I think is only now going to be ever more. Like when we talk about AI hallucinations and AI this and AI that, ChatGPT, and it's just the unending AI bandwagon conversation. There's such an emphasis on moving fast, moving quickly, maybe breaking things, but getting these things refined, and very little like what kind of evidence are you training these large language models on that allow them to think to reason thusly about name your cultural question. And it's a good question, and there's no good answer to it, but it's mostly pop cultural ephemera that finds its way into social media, right?
Yeah, you are exactly right. And you have just succinctly described some of the biggest tensions in my professional life. Oh my gosh.
I'll bet.
Let's just say in in the beginning kind of story, or that scenario you described, I have been both professionals, depending on the situation.
Right.
Because I have the technical expertise in the modeling, data science, machine learning, all that stuff, because I have both an anthropology, math
Yeah.
background, whatever. I can build that stuff. So I am often hired as the data scientist to come in and do that. And I have also been in instances where I've been hired, one of the social scientists hired later. Sometimes because I can speak their language, sometimes I can kind of slip in like how to
Right.
do it. But like for me personally, because like when I'm that initial data scientist coming in, I will think kind of like what you said to anthropologists of like, maybe we shouldn't be using this data. It's not actually a good representation of the community, whatever. And when the other data scientist comes in and says, well, this is the data we can use, we can't use that other data, I often come up with more creative ways to use that data because I have that tool set. Like I can actually think through how to do that. Sometimes you actually can't, unfortunately, but like in many times I can actually
Right.
construct that. So I guess sometimes that conversation happens in my own head because I'll be like thinking as a data scientist, but also as as like an anthropologist, and like be like, okay, what kind of data, what kind of things should we be analyzing?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think non-modelers often have a very static notion of what we mean, like stochastic, about a model, and so aren't necessarily aware of all the different ways in which people are innovating, tinkering, attempting to improve how these models work, are built, work, and for what. So, that being said, because it's so easy to use the term, the model, and then sort of write it off as some sort of, imposition on our lives. Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things, like what you said about, why it's the case that we see modeling in terms of, say, its application of social science knowledge tend toward more top-down and quantitative uses of data. I mean, obviously, one of the reasons is because one of the goals of models typically is their usability, which is a way of talking about their generalizability and scope. Mm-hmm. And so, if you're going to build a model, what you want it to do is more than just accurately depict some very small piece of social life somewhere. You instead want it to be highly usable and applicable in broad-based ways for a certain purpose. And so, I think there's necessarily built into the goals of modeling, that sense of we need to be at scale with this in some way, and we need to be able to generalize across diverse, data sets about X, Y, or Z. Otherwise, the model is not particularly useful. I also think that this is an epistemological issue, and that's one of the things that I think is underappreciated. So, I've been thinking a lot recently about, the data of data science. And, one of the reasons for that is that a little bit because of the pressures that the rapidly expanding popularity of data science, possibly inadvertently, are applying to sort of other epistemologically based forms of knowledge production within the academy in particular. So, like in my institution, of course, there's a data science center, and data science is, a very hot major, and, students are understandably very interested in becoming data scientists because there's the promise of, remuneration and whatever, and it's the growth economy. Now, all of this is also kind of very fluid and changing, and there are some signs that that's maybe not as not as sure a bet as it used to be even 5 years ago, 3 years ago. But whatever. And so my particular interest was, okay, well, what would be the sort of epistemological analog to, and I use analog, purposely, to, the kind of digital practices of data science. And, I sort of land on, kind of humanistic forms of interpretation or interpretive social science. And so kind of what do we mean with our interpretation in the context of, data science-based approaches to, social and cultural questions. And one of the things that is super fascinating to me is how data become available to various projects and what those data look like. And one of the things that for me seems clear is that there's a kind of a residual positivism. We say positivism, but and typically that's utilized as a pejorative. I don't mean it that way at all. I just mean that, for data scientists, what's useful is always already curated data. Like we can't just have, scribbled field notes. That's not helpful, right? So the structuring properties, the structured properties of data loom particularly large in data science projects of different sorts, because otherwise it's illegible, unusable. And so kind of tracing out what does that mean for kind of the role of, interpretation or semiosis or semiotics in a context of, our new, data science inflected big data universe. And that's a problem I'm very interested in. And I think of it as a conversation in which we should be participating, like what does interpretation look like? It used to be a hallmark of a kind of ethnographically driven social scientific practice. How is that sustainable within the academy at this time? and or are we sort of marginalizing those practices in favor of these much more powerful and much more broadly scoped and scaled big data type projects? And that's sort of like one corner of the conversation in which I've been trying to participate a little bit, really just to make sure that there's kind of an interesting and substantive exchange amongst these kinds of different epistemological starting points. How can we do better with both of these as we do our work? Where clearly data is going to be, at scale, a large part of any kind of future social science, broadly conceived, right? So simply saying no is not a good response to that.
Yeah, this makes total sense. I do think that I have definitely seen the types of problems you're talking about, where projects get focused on instances where there's a lot of data, which tends to be both very particular sets of circumstances where that data can get collected,
Yeah.
or context, we'll say, or like domains, but then also it just it forces, within the data science community, it forces people to look at a bigger scale that blurs a lot of things, like things from the that the environment looks very different from an airplane than when you're walking through on the ground.
Absolutely.
I think that kind of metaphorically will happen. I think one of the ironies is that in some data science programs are really trying to like beef up their social training. Like the Stanford program is a good example of this. And to be honest, in this broad area of tech, Stanford is often the leader that other programs, universities often copy. So that they're not like they're the one often. But like they're doing
Stanford. I mean,
basically
location.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're doing courses in like applied social science, basically, to teach data scientists social science skills.
Yeah.
That's actually a common tension, and I think this was hinted at in your previous example of basically data scientists hired to in effect, analyze data of what is a social science problem. It's a problem about people, understanding people, whether it's their behavior, it's their thoughts or perspectives, attitudes. Think from like a user research perspective, things like, are they satisfied? Like whatever, they're trying to understand something about people. That's a social science question. And I think there is a bit of a trend gap. I do think we might see new things that our models are capable of. I mean, even on a regular level, like generative AI, ChatGPT, the things people use to make images, like those are models, but they're almost creating whole new sets of use cases. Like love the technology, hate the technology.
Yes.
It's creating new things, new uses. Either way.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yeah. So like,
Agreed.
I wonder if part of me also wonders if there will be a shift, but also part of me is like, there hasn't been a shift in the past, so why would there be a shift now? But I guess time will tell. I think the irony is I like, I actually have a whole other podcast that I did years ago about this stuff, and a website where I talk about ways of connecting anthropology and data science. I'm actually revitalizing it, so this is a whole other.
Cool.
There are other ones where I actually go into a lot more detail. The name of the website is ethnodata, so ethno-data. I don't put the dash because it's a different person's website. So ethno-data, but
all right, duly noted.
Yeah, I guess
that's cool. No, that's really good. I think these are the conversations we should be having at this time in our collective, lives together. What you said, I think, really resonates. This idea that we tend to think of models as representational, like representing something, when increasingly models are generating cultural content and are part of the cultural zeitgeist, that we live in. And so it's sort of not reasonable to see them merely as tools to better understand some other thing. They are, in fact, also very much a part of kind of the cultural content of the times in which we currently live, and we need to think of them that way.
Yeah, I agree. And the final question I was going to ask you is, for people more interested in learning more about your work, where would you recommend they go? And yeah, so I guess, where are your plugs? I somehow plug my own self in my own
Oh,
podcast because I have other things that talked about this in more detail. But yeah,
as you should.
yeah.
Right. Uh, all right. I would be disappointed, and you would be a terrible podcaster if you did not. No. So there is. I have a very not good at this point, and in need of a definite resuscitation personal website, robertalbro.com. So that is something that people can still access, and it's got a nice Escher background that, at least that's the best part of it. But it lays out my various research orientations and is still reasonably accurate in that sense. And then there's my, faculty webpage at American University, american.edu, that has a lot of information about my current life and academic work. And then finally, I'm the Associate Director of American University's Center for Latin American Latino Studies, or CLAUS, as it's unfortunately acronymed. And at CLAUS, you can get a good sense of the various projects that I'm currently undertaking today. So that would be the third place to go.
Yeah, this is very helpful, and I'll try to include the links to all these in the description for anyone who wants to go check it out
Sure.
somewhere below. But yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk, and I hope you have a good rest of your morning.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed it a great deal. And lucky for you, you don't have any ice or snow problems where you are currently. So
Yes.
you should be thankful.
Yes, I'm in the tropics, and the problems I have are sunburn and not the winter storm. That is the case as we're recording this. When I post it, it might be spring, but who knows? But yes, yeah. Thank you.
There you go. There you go.
Um,
All right. Well, great to talk, Stephen.